welcome everyone to our second Fed Talk of the year. For those of you who may not be familiar, if this is your first time with the Fed Talks, we welcome you. If you're returning, we see you out there. We see a lot of alums and friends of the Key family out there. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. It's always an exciting topic whenever we get together and have these. We started doing these Fed Talks probably close to 10 years ago, and we continue to do them every year with a bunch of interesting things to discuss and learn, and that's why we're here today. You know, NASA is one of those organizations that generates excitement. It's got a magic to it. I certainly remember sitting on a shag rug in a little apartment in Austin, Texas, as a little boy watching Neil Armstrong step onto the moon. And it was everything about the organization and everything that it has brought and taught us over the years has just been tremendous. And this particular panel has generated a lot of excitement since we announced it some time ago. So with that, I just want to say thank you all. Looking forward to a terrific discussion. I'm going to pass this on to Andrew Hunter, who will introduce the panelists and take it from there. Andrew, thank you for everything and look forward to the panel.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm thrilled to be here today to introduce our panelists. I'm a retired deputy CFO from NASA. Several years ago, I left NASA. I'm now adjunct faculty with the Key program and working with new experienced leaders in federal agencies across the government. All our panelists today are experts and active participants in the exciting world of the new commercial space age. We have Brett Alexander. He is the Vice President of Civil Sales for Blue Origin, a company, a developer of rocket engines and space transportation capabilities, which he joined in 2011. Brett has served as a member of the FAA's Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee, as well as on NASA's advisory board. He's previously served as a senior policy analyst for space issues in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where he played a central role in the development of the vision for space exploration announced by President Bush in 2004. Brett served as president of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, the industry association of businesses and organizations working to make commercial human spaceflight a reality. He's held positions in the Federal Aviation Administration's Office of Commercial Space Transportation, the Aerospace Corporation, and Answer Corporation. Dr. Mary Lynn Dittmar is the Chief Government and External Affairs Officer for Axiom Space, where she directs Axiom's work with state, federal, and international governments, acting as a thought leader with the U.S. government's executive and legislative branches. She also leads Axiom Space Strategic Communications, promoting Axiom's mission to enable continuing human presence in and economic development of low Earth orbit. She previously served as president and CEO of the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration, an industry trade group supporting NASA's programs in human exploration and science. Her experience includes 6 years on the executive committee of the Space Studies Board of the National Academies, serving on the Human Spaceflight Committee of the National Research Council, acting as senior policy advisor for the International Space Station National Laboratory, and managing the Flight Operations Group while serving as a chief scientist for commercial payloads on the International Space Station program at Boeing. She serves as a member of the National Space Council Users Advisory Group and recently completed a 4-year appointment to the FAA's Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee. And finally, Phil McAllister is the director of the Commercial Spaceflight Program for NASA at NASA headquarters. He's been with NASA for 17 years as a member of the Senior Executive Service, where he oversees the Commercial Crew Program, which is partnering with SpaceX and Boeing to launch our astronauts to the International Space Station. He also oversees the Commercial Low Earth Orbit Program, designed to help the private sector develop commercial space stations targeted for launch in the latter part of the decade, so that the International Space Station can be retired in 2030. Prior to NASA, Phil served in a variety of executive roles for large aerospace companies, small consulting firms, and a nonprofit. So I'm going to kick it off here. And Phil, you have been with the commercial program at NASA as long as I remember. We've together many, many years. From personal experience, I know it is not easy changing the status quo in Washington, right? From a centralized and government-controlled access to space paradigm to the current commercial space economic model. I remember back in the 2011 budget, we submitted a request for a program about $6 billion worth of commercial crew and cargo program over 5 years. I also remember that the program received only about a third of that requested amount over the next 5 years. So we had many battles. And we also had many people talking about the end of the space program when the space shuttle was retired in 2011. It was expensive and unsustainable if NASA wanted to continue exploration of space beyond low Earth orbit. Now, it seems like every week we hear of a successful commercial launch into space by numerous companies, big and small. And recently, SpaceX launched 3 successful Falcon 9 rockets in less than 36 hours. Pretty amazing. And several days ago, like any space endeavor, it had a test failure. Space is hard, right? This transition from government control to commercial did not just happen by accident. It was intentional. I remember the whole logic back then to do it. Could you give us your perspective on how things have changed between NASA and commercial space over the years?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Andrew, and hello to everybody out there. I understand you're all federal employees, so this is my tribe. I feel real warm and comfortable here, and glad to be here. Also, I hope everybody's enjoying the James Webb Space Telescope pictures. I took those myself. But anyway, that's been a really exciting thing. So what Andrew has talked about, I think even if for you guys that maybe don't follow the space industry, you're probably aware that something seems a little different, right? In the past, NASA was, I think, synonymous with space. Any sort of space endeavor, we were either leading it or maybe partnered with an international organization, but NASA was very much front and center. And I think that's because in the first, say, 50 years of NASA's existence, we did things kind of one way, and we had to do them, right? When we needed to go to the moon, there was no infrastructure that you could leverage commercially or otherwise. We had to build it ourselves. When we wanted a space transportation capability, we had to build the shuttle. You can't go to the yellow pages and look up space transportation and pick out a company. It just didn't happen back then in the late 70s, early 80s when we were designing the space shuttle. So all those big endeavors, Apollo, shuttle, space station, were all done a very similar way. NASA would write very, very detailed requirements, thousands and thousands of requirements. We would let a very large procurement, usually with a cost plus contracting mechanism where you would pay for the company's costs and then a small profit above that. And NASA would own and operate all that hardware. And that's really the way it was for about 50 years, because there weren't any other customers for space capabilities at that time. It was so nascent, and the costs were fairly large that you just didn't see a lot of other markets for these services. That all began to change, I would say, about 15 years ago, with the emergence of some entrepreneurial companies that were looking for business opportunities, as well as a recognition on the part of NASA and some of our stakeholders that a lot of our activities had become unsustainable, as Andrew had said, very, very expensive. And I think that's because those of us in the government, almost all the incentives that we have are towards lowering risk. We're all obviously conscious of costs, but I will say personally for NASA, my personal opinion is that's very much a secondary or even tertiary consideration above or behind mission success and risk mitigation. So you're always trying to reduce risk. That generally provides a very expensive service to the point where no other customers could afford them. So it was this kind of self-reinforcing paradigm where we couldn't really break that down. And about 15 years ago, things changed with those sorts of new companies that were looking for business opportunities, looking to reduce the cost for space transportation, and also a recognition by NASA that we really needed to do things differently. And the big change is utilizing public-private partnerships. So instead of a cost-plus contract with one prime contractor, what we found was competition is really important, and let's use fixed-price contracting, and let's try and lift up the level of requirements so that you don't have thousands and thousands of requirements. You have maybe a few hundred. And then you put some of that responsibility on your private sector partner. And so it's very much a shared accountability model where each partner, the public sector and the private sector partner, share risks, they share technical capabilities, and they share the costs. And what we found is in the right scenario, it doesn't work for everything, but in the right scenario, a public-private partnership can be very, very effective because it sort of brings the best of both worlds. In the private sector, where I used to work, we would be hyper-focused on cost and speed. Those are the key sort of currency ingredients in the private sector. At NASA, it's more consensus oriented, and we have this treasure trove of human spaceflight experience. And so when you bring those two together, one company that really wants to push the envelope, and maybe NASA saying, well, let's talk about this a little bit more, but it's not one way or the other. You have sort of a healthy tension between those two organizations. And what we found, utilizing these public-private partnerships with fixed price milestones and pay for performance, that you really can break that paradigm. And we've seen much more cost-effective, equally reliable, equally safe spacecraft come out of these public-private partnerships. We did it for cargo transportation, the International Space Station. We're currently doing it for crew transportation. And the next thing on the horizon is destinations. Once we retire the ISS in 2030, we want to have private companies with private space stations. Two of our partners are represented on this panel, and I can't wait to hear what they have to say. And that is the plan. We're going to transition and retire the ISS by 2030, and we hope to have private sector capabilities that we're enabled again through this public-private partnership approach to be available in the latter part of this decade. It's very, very exciting. I have to say, it's just invigorated our entire industry, in my opinion. I'll give you one story and then I'll stop talking. Sorry, Andrew, to start going on so long. I was down in Cape Canaveral for the very last shuttle launch at a hotel, and everybody was just so depressed that the shuttle was coming to an end. And I was sad too. But like the hotel, they were like, we're probably going to have to go out of business because a big part of our business was shuttle launches, those 4 or 5 a year. I can tell you, I just went down to Cocoa Beach. There's at least 7 or 8 more hotels than were back then in 2011. And I still couldn't get a room. I had to stay over in Titusville. It has just invigorated and just expanded the opportunities, the capabilities for a lot of people to fly to space, to utilize space capabilities. And that's what's been very exciting.
Thank you, Phil. Marilyn and Brett, any perspectives from your point of view? Any growing pains in the last several years?
I'll take that on. I think, what the history that Phil gave had a lot of growing pains, right? It started with what was known as the COTS program, Commercial Orbital Transportation Services Program, in the 2006 timeframe. And so we're talking about 16, 17 years as we went through the commercial cargo, then commercial crew, human landing systems for the Artemis lunar program, and now orbital destinations, commercial orbital destinations, ISS, International Space Station replacement. There have been tons of growing pains in there. There have been lawsuits and protests and congressional debate over the utility of doing them as, quote, other transactions agreements versus traditional contracts. There's been, disagreement within NASA, within the industry, et cetera. But all of that healthy tension, as Phil described it, has yielded a very changed environment, and one that goes back to one of the founding reasons for NASA and what's in its founding document, or at least was added shortly thereafter, which was the commercialization of space, bringing space to the average American, having an industry take over space activities, which really didn't happen before the end of the shuttle. It really was these commercial programs that said, hey, NASA needs a capability, but commercial industry can do something with that capability too. Let's work together in a different way. And that policy change, that acquisition strategy change, the legal mechanisms behind it have been created over that 16, 17 years by that dialogue between industry, NASA, Congress, and everybody else. And it wouldn't have, it wasn't a smooth process. It's still not a smooth process. Nothing ever is. But it has made the space program much better, much more resilient, and much more sustainable over the long term. And the economic benefits, you now see, hundreds of space companies in the U.S., not just the traditional primes that we always think of. And there is a real dynamism that is bleeding over into national security space and into U.S. economic leadership and U.S. leadership around the world. So it's been fantastic. But yeah, there have been growing pains as well.
Mary Lynn, any?
Not much to add to that. I mean, they've covered the landscape pretty well here.
I will add, Andrew, if I could, something Brett said, I think is important for the audience. One of the biggest difficulties NASA had in this transformation, which, as Brett said accurately, is still ongoing. There's still some people that sort of harken back to the good old days. And the biggest hurdle that we had to overtake was relinquishing control. And for those of you in the government agencies, that can be kind of a scary thing, right? Like I said before, NASA owned and operated all the hardware before. We made all the decisions about the propulsion and the structures and just everything, the launch vehicles. To cede some of that control to a partner that maybe you're not even familiar with or might not even have a big track record, that was one of the biggest things to get my colleagues to overcome. Having come from the private sector, I was fairly confident. I'd seen private sector people or organizations do things very successfully that had human life on the line, and I knew that they were capable and had some of the right incentives, partnered with NASA. That was the most difficult thing for some of my colleagues to overcome. So for those of you in federal agencies that are used to doing things one way and maybe even thinking that is the only way for success, I thought that way too, and almost everybody at NASA probably thought that way too about 20 years ago. And if we had kept that mindset, our aspirations in space would be so much more limited today. We would, if you think about it, we would be limited by NASA's budget. Nobody else would be doing anything. Whatever NASA got, that was all we'd been doing in space. And today, with all those hundreds of companies that Brett mentioned, they're all bringing their dollars to the table. So NASA's budget gets magnified and multiplied several times with these private companies coming in, making their investments, and also bringing down costs for NASA. So that's for those federal employees. You don't want to just take change and do change for change's sake, but also don't stay in the same paradigm without sort of opening the blinders and thinking outside the box and maybe letting other companies into what may be a very small community in your own agencies.
I guess I'd add to that some of the, at least from my perspective as an outsider, but kind of a close outsider, my perspective was a lot of that fear of loss of control also just had to do with risk. I mean, we started the conversation, Andrew, you did, by talking about sort of perception of, and I filled it too, in terms of how NASA managed risk. And NASA managed risk in part by generating requirements right down to I was involved in the building of the space station. The requirements matrix required entirely new software tools just to be able to manage the requirement set. And so when all of a sudden you're handing that over and going to higher level requirements and saying, okay, we want stuff that does this, as opposed to we want stuff that does this, and here's how we want you to do it. That's a real, it is increased risk. And I think the perception of that was just sort of terrifying. The other thing is, these have involved different procurement approaches, and the procurement approaches that are involved now, other transactional authorities, I think, as Brett mentioned, Space Act agreements, they're versions of something called a CRADA, which has existed for a long time inside the DoD. And NASA really had been using it, but in a limited way. And they had tended to be using it for kind of R&D sorts of projects. It was real different when you start moving to sort of operating a program that way. And across the whole government, we know we have issues with how procurement is managed on behalf of the United States government. This is not a new thing I'm saying. It's something we've been talking about for 40 years. We do seem to have some difficulty getting our arms around it. And when you start saying things like OTAs and Space Act agreements, are they reimbursed or not reimbursed, you have to train people to be able to figure out how do you actually let contracts that are structured under those ways, right? How do you do calls that are done in those ways? And it's much easier for people who've been used to doing things a certain way for a long period of time just to keep on doing it that way. So there were some bumps, and there still are, and it's not just in NASA, by the way, it's in other agencies. There are bumps in sort of moving into these, I'll just call them non-traditional procurement mechanisms, and the government as a whole faces a challenge, right? How do we figure out how to match the best procurement mechanism to what the goals are? And how do we figure out how to do that? That's non-trivial. It's hard to do. And I think that's been one of the other places where there's sort of been some starts and stops.
Okay, Mary Lynn, I'm going to sort of focus this next sort of area, see what perspectives you have here too. When I see the big personalities of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson and all the other space entrepreneurs, you can be reminded of the roles of the captains of industry, the robber barons, the wealthy elite of the late 19th century, the John D. Rockefellers, Andrew Carnegie's, J.P. Morgan, Henry Ford. Do you see similarities? And if so, what are the longer term effects of their activities and achievements? You know, these wealthy few.
Well, there've been some whole books written on this, right? And I don't want to step on those authors. Chris Davenport from Washington Post wrote one called "The Space Barons." There have been some other folks that have done some stuff where they've, you know, observed some of these similarities. Roger Lanius, who used to be the chief historian for NASA, actually has a whole monograph on looking at sort of comparisons, not between the personalities so much as between the effort. So the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad, and the railroad system in the United States. That was driven by a lot of these folks. And then of course you have the Seven Sisters come along. And so I would say there absolutely are comparisons. It's interesting that they're sort of still in transportation, which a lot of the names that you just mentioned were certainly related to open new transportation corridors and new transportation technologies and capabilities in the United States. And if you talk about the railroads, that was a kind of public-private partnership, right? There was a huge land grant by the federal government, you know, associated with building the railroads. But it does seem to take, at least in our system, it does seem to take really strong personalities to sort of get these things going and amass the fortunes that are necessary in order to be able to get them going. And so I think all you have to do is look to history to see some of those impacts. And I do think we're seeing echoes of that now, you know, with Bezos and with Musk and also with a lot of their investors. And sometimes the focus gets just with them. Now they're investors too, right? I mean, they're not just the heads of these companies and corporations with the vision, but they're also investing. I mean, there are other investors that are along with them, and just like there were in the early 1900s, late 1800s. So I think there are some real strong parallels. I think they've had a huge impact. I don't think you have to look very far to sort of see what that impact has been. You know, SpaceX has done tremendous things technically and projected what the business model was, right? We're going to lower the cost of transportation. And then the assumption is going to be that that's going to open up a lot of other capabilities. You know, Musk wants to go to Mars. Okay, we'll see. I've done that study. It's tough. But, you know, we'll see. Bezos's vision is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brett, is move a lot of the industrialized processes off the face of the earth and get them into space, in part to save all the ecological damage here, but also to sort of, you know, move human beings into space. So I think these visions are tremendous. I think they've inspired a lot of people, and they've certainly impacted the industry.
Brett, any inspirations of moving industry off the earth? Are you going to do what your boss wants?
Well, I would say that you know, the Blue Origin vision is long-term vision, millions of people living and working in space for the benefit of Earth, right? And that, as Mary Lynn said, is really about moving heavy industry off of Earth so that the Earth is not under the same ecological pressure, right? But it's also about, you know, Earth is finite from a resource perspective. Population keeps growing, energy consumption per person keeps growing. Something's going to have to give. Rather than cap population growth and cap energy usage, it's better to move people off of Earth and start to, you know, to utilize the limitless resources that are out there in the solar system and elsewhere. So that is the vision that's hundreds and hundreds of years in the future. And it's our job really to, or our mission to put in those basic infrastructure elements that will enable that. So it's reliable, cost effective, and safe transportation, right? Putting people in space was not the safest thing around. The space shuttle for 30 years was not making it safer. Now with commercial crew, thanks to NASA, with commercial crew, you have systems where those products, those capabilities are improving over time. So cost will go down, safety will go up over time. That's what we need. We now have reusable rockets because of the investment that NASA did with SpaceX, but also the investment that our founder Jeff Bezos has done with New Shepard and New Glenn for us. So, personalities matter, but personalities on the government side matter too. And I think the government choice, the NASA choice, 16 years ago by Mike Griffin to instill a commercial activity inside of what was being done there really changed the game. And that in partnership with industry has spawned all of this. So it takes a village, it takes an industry, it takes a community, but it takes those public-private partnerships to really be successful.
So now that we're in this brave new world, I'm sure you stay up at night thinking about all the space-related issues that you see now and as we move into the future. Regulatory issues. You both have been on the FAA side of things. You've seen they've got a new associate administrator for commercial space, right? The regulatory door is opening up there. How you manage property rights, mining, the geopolitical issues that may arise. Somebody was saying China wants to take over the moon. How's that all going to work out? Anybody have an answer for some of these, or any of these keep you up at night more than others?
Well, I think anyone that's been working in space on any side, I mean, wherever they are working, is a little edgy when you start talking about regulatory frameworks. And the thing that makes everybody always talks about this as applies to business, but it's also true. I think, Phil, you would agree with regard to to NASA and FAA. It's not just the private side of it, but we get pretty nervous about unpredictability in those frameworks. It needs a certain amount, or prefers a certain amount of predictability. And so I think when we start to get nervous is when you have an environment going on for a while, like there's a few right now that are pretty hot. I mean, and they're hot inside Washington. We talk about space situational awareness, right? And how is that being managed? And it's taken Congress. I'm sure I've made a lot of friends in the last 2 years by basically being at conferences and going, do your job. It's taken Congress a while to make decisions about where does it want to place the authority to work on that, and then how does it want to fund that? All the work that's involved in that. And space situational awareness for people who aren't space people is there's a lot of stuff up there, and it's moving fast. And if you want to put other stuff up there and you're interested in anything from launch to putting habitats up, understanding what's happening in that environment is real important. It's important both on the public side of things and on the military side of things, right? So space situational awareness is something we pay a lot of attention to. A related issue is space traffic management. People coming, people going, stuff coming, stuff going. How do you manage all of that? How do you authorize missions for on orbit, right? The FAA is responsible for assuring public safety for launch and reentry, but once you're there, it's been, as Phil's pointed out, I mean, it's been a government game, right, for a long period of time. Once you start doing that commercially, who's responsible for all those things? So I can just speak for myself. When we're at the very early stages of trying to define all that, I get nervous because I don't want to see Congress or another body coming in and going, oh, we have to control absolutely everything. We're back to that word again. We have to control absolutely everything. And so we're going to write really strong regulatory controls. Well, that's not too good because that stifles innovation. And on the other hand, this is my view, and I believe you'll find plenty of people to debate me. The wild, wild west version of this, okay, which is we're not going to do anything. We're just going to wait and see how everything plays out. That makes me a little nervous. So, you know, how we work through that. I will say, I think the space community has gotten better over the last 20 years at engaging with these issues and putting people on it who are really thoughtful and kind of handle those tensions pretty well. And I think industry's gotten better at engaging with these kinds of issues. So that's my 2 cents.
Just to add on to that, you know, NASA is not a regulatory agency. We are an exploration agency. And yet, because the space transportation, this transportation mode called space transportation is so sort of new, there's not a lot of federal government structure, regulatory or otherwise, around that. It's going to have to get created because NASA is by default performing a regulatory function, which we would prefer not to, right? When we let the contracts with SpaceX and Boeing to transport our astronauts to and from the International Space Station, there were no safety regulations for that. We had to incorporate those safety requirements into our contracts, and then we had to certify that those systems satisfied those requirements. So that is the de facto regulatory function that NASA is performing. We prefer not to do that. The long-term vision is 2 weeks ago, I bought a ticket on American Airlines. I went down, I did my work at Johnson Space Center, and then I came back. We would like to have that same paradigm for doing things in low Earth orbit. Me as a NASA employee, I would buy a ticket that would be regulated. That transportation mode would be regulated by somebody else. I would go to a low Earth orbit destination, do my experiment, do whatever I needed to do, and then come back. That is the vision, and that's where we would like to go. But we need other parts of the federal government to step up and do that role. And right now, we're kind of in this, we're not quite sure, right? We're arguing it out. As Marilyn said, there's people sort of uncomfortable on one side, there's people uncomfortable on the other side, and it's not really clear where we're going to go. That's a difficult place for the federal government, right? You usually go when there's a huge consensus. We don't have that today. But I can tell you, probably something that maybe didn't exist 5 or 6 years ago is a recognition on the side within NASA is that we don't want to be doing this. We want to divest those functions to other federal agencies so that we can explore and go further, faster, where there may not be an economic incentive. There's all kinds of cool places in the solar system. The moons of Jupiter look fascinating. Mars is beckoning, obviously. It's going back to the moon. I think we should go to all these places. But we can't I don't think we can until we really make a more robust, I don't want to say robust, but more robust environment so that entrepreneurs, risk takers, businessmen and women have some certainty about how their investment is going to get used and how they're going to get a return on that. We do have a regulatory environment. It's relatively it's not significantly robust, maybe that's the way to put it. And I think long-term, as we see more people flying, more people doing different things in space, private destinations owned and operated by private companies, we are going to have to see more regulation. And NASA I can tell you, my leadership is very much like, we will help you. We give you a lot of this data and human health, safety data, but we don't want to be doing those functions. But somebody's got to step up to do that.
So we're starting with passengers, astronauts. We started with astronauts, and we're moving to regular old people being passengers, and then we're going to move to tourism, and then we're going to settle, right? Send settlers out there. Is that the progression?
That is the goal, and I think right now it is still very expensive, obviously, and so I know the narrative out there is, these are just billionaires taking their rides. And I don't see it that way at all. As you said, you got Brett's long-term vision from Jeff Bezos and his company. This is just a first step, flying people to space. It's just a first step. Same thing with Richard Branson and Virgin Galactic. Their vision is to connect people across the globe So you have this transportation capability where you can go coast to coast or continent to continent super quickly. SpaceX's long-term vision is obviously having human beings be a multi-planet species to basically save humanity. You can put it that way. So all these companies have very long-term visions. These space transportation and flying millionaires to space is just really a first step. And every mode of transportation we've seen starts off very expensive. If you think 50, 60 years ago, not many people could afford a flight from Boston to Los Angeles. Today, that is much more affordable by a lot more people. And we're hoping to see the same thing in space, right? As more entrepreneurs come in and they compete for market share and they bring costs down and hopefully safety goes up, and people think of new things to do in space, that's going to attract more people. More people are going to want to do more and different things. And I really feel like there'll be a self-reinforcing paradigm. You might not be able to see it today, but that's the way I see it. And that's the way I hope it's going to play out in the next few years.
Yeah, the amount of money, I have a figure here that in 2019, 95% of estimated $366 billion in revenue earned in the space sector was from space for the Earth economy, which means related to telecom, internet infrastructure, Earth observation, national security, with the decreasing cost to get into space all along the way. Now we're at this new sort of place where we're going to have a space for space economy, create our influence is going to expand economically and geopolitically, mining the moon or the asteroids, constructing habitats in space or supply refueling depots, struggling now, but setting the stage for that to happen. Are you guys all bullish on that kind of picture in the future?
I'll take that on. I'm certainly bullish on that future. Again, it's about how long does it take to get there. I think NASA's Artemis program to return humans to the moon is the necessary first step. But why Artemis is different from Apollo is that number one, we'll be going for the long term. Number two, it won't just be NASA going and coming right back. It'll be international entities, industry going. It's a whole community that's going, and NASA's leadership in that. If I could put my I'm usually a half glass, half empty kind of guy, but if I put my glass half full hat back on, we want U.S. space leadership. We are the leaders in the world. As we move out into the moon and elsewhere, we want to extend that leadership. And that leadership really comes by taking everybody with you. And industry is a big, important part of that. Because as the framework of exploration and industry goes out into the solar system, if you will, the question is, what culture goes with it? What set of rules? What's the rule of law that goes there? What's the paradigm that will set those next few hundred years on that course that gets us to millions of people living and working in space? And so when it comes to the regulatory discussion, I'm glad we're having that discussion here in the United States. People can complain about, government bureaucracy and regulation, et cetera. I would rather be doing that conversation here than anywhere else in the world. And the US really is the leader. So of those hundreds and thousands of companies involved in space, the vast majority of those are American. They're based here. The funding is coming from here. And we really, this is a problem. The regulatory problem, if you will, is one that is an enabler for that future. And we've got to get it right to maintain that US leadership. So
we do have a question in chat related to what you've just been talking about, Brett. How do you see the state of commercial space in the United States compared to Europe?
Yeah, I think my own view is that Europe is very technically excellent, but much more government oriented still, like we were 15 years ago. The commercial entities in Europe are, they're more nascent. They're trying to replicate basically the success that we've had in growing a commercial industry here. No doubt they will get there, but if it takes them another decade to get where we are now, we'll be a decade ahead. But they are our best partners on government space and on commercial space as well. There are other areas of the world that are less friendly and less inclined to be partners. And so, I think what Europe is doing is right there with us, and they're great partners.
I led an industry working group in 1999 and 2000, really dating myself here. That was an international working group with the Japanese, the Canadians, 2 representatives from ESA, one from Germany, one from Italy, the United States, and then the Russians there sort of as observers also. And I will say that, and then was also involved in the late 2000s in another effort that ESA undertook to sort of see if there was really industry interest in coming to the table. Late 2000s, no, that's really maybe early 20, I said 2012, 2013. See if there was industry interest in coming to the table with the idea of this public-private partnership, and there really wasn't. The mindset was much more, government-driven. And I agree also that it still is that way. They're great partners. I will say, though, that there are changes that are beginning to occur across individual governments. So Axiom Space just signed an MOU with Italy. And it's kind of fun for me that all these years later, I'm back working and advising a working group. And that working group is really interested in setting up industry and government relationships to explore avenues for industry to become more invested in, I mean that literally, as well as engaged in commercial space. And with Axiom, they're doing it through our development of our module, right? So they're interested in how do you establish, this will sound very familiar, how to establish relationships with adjacent industries? How do you bring in industries that have not traditionally been involved in space in Europe and certainly in Italy? And then there's some other governments that we're talking to that are doing similar things. And so I think, you're starting to see it, and it's coming around the corner here, and it'll be really interesting to see. Our view is commercial space is through our public-private partnership with NASA is actually helping to lead this because then we're seen as potential partners, right, by some of those governments in Europe. And so it's a very interesting value chain that's being established. And again, kudos, to NASA for having stepped out on the public-private partnership, because if that hadn't happened, I don't think this would be happening.
Yeah, I'll just dovetail on that. Sorry, Andrew. In terms of Europe, agree with Brett. They're excellent partners. They do have some very good technologies and capabilities. At the same time, we are crushing it in commercial space in the United States. We are absolutely crushing it. Representatives from a lot of those other agencies have come to see me at NASA and said, how did you do this public-private partnership thing? So they are very much as following our lead in that. And I think that's a really good thing. And I'm not real nervous about it. As good technologically and as they are, and they have these very good capabilities, I really feel like we have the sort of the primordial soup that enables our commercial industry to thrive better than anybody else. We have a recognition that we want the private sector to be successful. As Brett said, it's in the NASA Space Act that we help the commercialization of space. I don't think you have those same exact type of ingredients in Europe and some of these other countries that are going to enable their industries to thrive like we have. I'm very proud of that. I like when they come and they talk and I said, well, this is the way you do it. And I can see sometimes it doesn't even compute because of the unique government industry relationship that we have, the unique sort of rules and regulations, regulatory functions. Sometimes they don't even understand, or they might say, oh, I do understand that. We could never do that in our country. So I do think, I'm glad that they're following along. But again, I agree with Brett. In 10 years, we'll be even more 10 years ahead. Just because I think of the unique sort of situation that we have, our national space policy says that we should not be competing with the private sector. The private sector has a capability. U.S. government agencies and other people should use that way in favor of any kind of government capability. And so I think
I'll ask you
it becomes very positive.
A trick question here, Phil. If we can't compete, Musk says he can go to Mars. He's got his one of the biggest rockets he's making, and we're also building our space launch system, our SLS and Orion, the Artemis program. Who's going to launch first? That's the question. It's a trick question. I don't know the answer.
My door. I think, big tent. I'm not going to weigh in on who goes first. They're each have interesting capabilities. And, I think one of the good things, and one of the things that we saw in COTS, the commercial cargo program, which is really what started all this, was there were a lot of people had objections to that, a lot of concern about safety. Mary Lynn mentioned that. This was a big leap for some people into giving up that control. I felt like I had arguments to respond to these concerns, like, here's my argument why that really won't be a concern. I didn't make a lot of progress. When I did start to make progress is when these companies actually performed, right? So performance will dictate. We can all sit here and maybe, tea leaf what's going to happen in the future. But in my point, we'll see who performs, and the marketplace will make its decision, and we will go forward from there. And right now, we're in a period where we got to see who's going to perform. We have 4 partners with our commercial space station program: Axiom's one, Blue Origin's one, NanoRacks, and Northrop Grumman. Got to see how they perform. We're not going to probably be able to support all 4, right? So let's get in there, let's compete, and let's see how the market shakes out, as well as see how these companies perform. And I think that's really what's going to change people's perspective and opinions about what we can do and how fast we can do. And I think that's a good thing. That's what it should be.
Yeah, great. Beyond transportation, what will make money out there? I'm trying to get some insider information here. So, commercial space requires revenue, and folks have been looking for the killer app for a long time. So I'm wondering if any of you, our panelists, have some tips for the next generation of space entrepreneurs.
I would say that the killer app is people. It always has been and always will be. And so, getting people into space and letting them do all the sorts of things they want to do, from adventure tourism to, destination to, research or manufacturing, whatever it is, people are the key. And I think that's why we haven't had a lot of commercialization of that side of space, the human spaceflight side of space, until now, when you've gotten the private sector engaged.
I'd agree with that. And I'd also say, at least initially, you talked before about developing the in-space economy, but really in LEO for quite a while, it's still going to be an Earth-based economy that's, then being expressed in space, or sort of pushed forward in space. And what I would point people to is what makes a lot of money on Earth. One of the things that we don't talk about very much is the amount of revenue that's going to have to be generated in order to support these stations. NASA's role in research and development, and then also transportation, to the extent that continues to be subsidized. These are all questions for debate over time, but that's not going to allow for us to continue sort of developing these sorts of modules. You're really going to be finding money. You have to do money. And I'll sort of tell you a story. Back when I was chief scientist for commercial payloads at Boeing 20 years ago, I got really interested in looking at what generated a lot of money that had technology interests. And I found out that at the time, bass fishing generated more than $6 billion in revenue worldwide. This was 20 years ago. I got no idea what it is now. Okay. And so I went to my friends at Boeing. I was always a little out of step. I went to my friends at Boeing and said, bass fishing. And they kind of looked at me and I went, space station, sensors, bass fishing. And the idea obviously was, can you develop technology that allows you to track what's going on with bass? Okay. And then sell that downlinked, right, in some way. And so stick it in your Garmin receiver on your boat. Okay. Was sort of the idea. Well, I know that sounds sort of funny, but when you start thinking about things like entertainment, for example, that's one that's sort of being talked about. It's a multi-billion-dollar, maybe more than that, industry on Earth. What are those things that people are really interested in pursuing in space? And over time, there's been resistance to that kind of stuff because it's just a money-making enterprise. It may or may not have any research value to it at all, right? But we're going to have to be serious about generating revenue. I agree with what Brett said. People, what do people want? What are they going to use space for? And I was trained as a scientist. I am in no way trying to set aside any of the billions of dollars that could be generated for breakthrough science, or science is actually done on the government dime that eventually comes to the market. I'm a huge proponent of all of it. But what I am saying is I think that for a while anyway, it's going to be the same things that generate a lot of money on Earth that we're going to sort of be looking for levers to see if there's a way to sort of execute some of those in space.
I got a
We
couple
did not
of questions
ahead of time, but I agree with my fellow panelists. It is all about the people. I really do agree. And I don't quite understand, Mary Lynn, you actually touched on this, why we feel like endeavors in space have to meet some higher purpose or be somehow scientifically driven. I just don't understand that narrative at all. First of all, the kinds of things that Brett's company is doing by allowing people to fly to suborbital space and to see the Earth from space, that's a life-changing activity, something that people have wanted to do their whole lives. So providing a service that people have wanted to do their whole lives, that has inherent value right there. I looked up the potato chip industry is about $6 billion. It doesn't need to meet any higher purpose other than the fact I love potato chips. So I don't quite understand why we have to bring this other narrative to space endeavors. And what I would say in terms of the killer app, if anybody out there in the federal government is thinking about starting their own company and their space company, and I wholeheartedly encourage you to do that, think about being a customer. Don't be a supplier. We have plenty of suppliers. I think I might actually be stealing this from Brett 10 years ago. Maybe, tell me if this was your idea, Brett. But when people think about starting a space company or doing something in space, it's always like the hardware. It's always like, oh, I got to build a rocket, or I got to build a space station, or a satellite. Think about being a customer of those sorts of things. It's way better being a customer than a supplier, because the suppliers then come to you and take you out to lunch and make sure that you're happy. And that's a way better place to be in, I got to tell you. So for anybody thinking about starting out, think about just what Mary Lynn said. What is the customer? As a customer, what would you want to be in a space endeavor? And I think that is going to make a big difference. And with transportation costs coming down, things that were not profitable before are suddenly going to be profitable. There were so few markets that could be profitable at the dollars per kilogram it took to transport something to space. Those things are going down. Those costs are going down by an order of magnitude. And so the things that weren't possible before are suddenly going to be possible. And we will be thinking all kinds of different things to do that we haven't thought of before, because we've been in this mindset where space is only about science. Well, it could be about anything. And that's perfectly fine in my mind.
Very exciting. Hey, just a couple of questions here I want to in the chat. Sonia asks, there's been a lot of discussion about regulatory control. Now, I'm wondering how is the Outer Space Treaty enforced? Is there talk of developing a global body for regulatory issues, like The Hague, or that sort of question? Any thoughts there?
I don't see a lot of energy there now, to be honest.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. So the Outer Space Treaty, has most of the nations on Earth have signed on to it. The UN has an organization, the Office for Outer Space Affairs, that runs those treaties and pays attention to them in that way. And U.S. participates in the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in the UN every year. I think what the next phase of what we're seeing, there's two things. There is the industry, commercial, and regulatory sort of framework that butts up against the Outer Space Treaty, which was really about nation states owning and having control over their satellite assets. So commercial was allowed under nation states, but how does it work? That's one issue. But the other is the security issues, or the militarization of space, or the threats that are coming from capabilities that our peer adversaries have been developing and fielding rapidly over the last few years, that that, there aren't really those norms of behavior, right? If you're on the sea and a ship passes in front of you, from a naval perspective, they know what's a threat and what's not, a threatening action. In space, that's not clear. There aren't rules or guidelines that say doing that maneuver is unsafe, or you didn't give us warning about this. So there's a conversation going along in that world that's important to the future, and there's a conversation going along on the commercialization regulatory front that's also important to the future, that fits within that sort of overarching framework on the Outer Space Treaty and history.
I will say something that kind of follows on an earlier discussion about, I think it was Brett that you were talking about, the importance of the fact that a lot of these discussions now are really rest in the United States. It's not only important because of the way that we have the discussions, which are pretty open and sometimes pretty heated. And that's fine. I mean, it's like to have all that, but also what the United States ends up doing in terms of regulatory process and framework. It's really important that we do it and then put it out there, because other nations look to us. What are they doing? And it's not to say that we're always going to agree with them, okay, or that they're going to always agree with us, but more often than not, when we start to put in place a coherent framework with a logic and rationale that goes along with it, other nations are likely to sign on. This is not regulatory, but looking at the Artemis Accords, okay, to sort of see what's happening, right? United States leadership there, and now you have nation after nation beginning to sign up. It's true with regard to regulatory frameworks too. A regulatory approach that's been through all the heat and the fire and has had a chance to sort of get fleshed out, and then is going out there. Great example, okay, is the whole question having to do with mining. We're now more than 10 years into this discussion, and it is still controversial internationally. But when you started, you could barely even talk about it. And then Congress passed a law, okay, that basically said, hey, you know what? So it's very important that the United States do this. And there's also a real key leadership aspect there, that we do it and we put it out there and invite other nations to take a look at it and weigh in and join us. And I don't want to let that pass by, because going back again to the question about whose values do you want to have lead this? Ours.
I have a couple questions on the same topic here about insurance. What are the challenges in obtaining sufficient insurance related to commercial space, and which legal body would enforce insurance claims resulting from mishaps in space? Any lawyers amongst us here?
I would say that the satellite launch insurance market is very mature. It's been providing insurance products for 25, 30 or 35 years, certainly my entire career. The extension of that to other activities, to human space flight that's non-NASA related, et cetera, remains to be fleshed out. But the framework's there, the capacity of the market, the insurance market is there, and some of the technological or technical understanding of the area is there. So I have no doubt that market will mature as the capabilities and products come on the market and mature themselves. It's a necessary, essential element, but I do think it's in a good place and will be there when it's needed.
Good, thanks. And another question here.
Phil, you're on mute.
Yep. Sorry.
Oh,
thanks.
Go ahead, Phil.
I think that's a key thing. I'm hopeful, like Brett, that we'll get there when we need to be there. Today, we are not. If either one of my fellow panelists companies put their modules in space today, I don't believe that would be insurable for right now. Now, we are having conversations with the insurance industry. I know you guys are too, and we need to get there. Sometimes I wake up and I'm like, oh my God, it's going to stop everything. And then others, I'm more sanguine like Brett. It's like, oh, we'll figure this out. I do think we will figure it out, but I think it might require some new mechanisms some new, some just new mechanisms to think about this. I mean, a multi-billion-dollar spacecraft in orbit with high net worth people on board is a very unique challenge, I think, for the insurance industry. But it's something we absolutely going to have, or those private stations are not going to be able to fly. So we got to figure that out, I would say. I'll give you an instance, maybe why I'm thinking this is a little bit more difficult. We just sort of dipped our toe into this with a private astronaut mission, which Mary Lynn's company performed just this year, actually, very successfully. It was a kind of partnership with NASA. Axiom procured that flight, found the customers. It was flown under an FAA license. And then when it got close to the International Space Station, these were all 4 people on board were civilians. So NASA didn't regulate that flight whatsoever. But when it came onto the International Space Station, then NASA did have responsibility for those private astronauts. And they spent a couple of weeks on the International Space Station doing things and talking to people and just having a good time and doing a lot of experiments and science while they were on orbit. There was no there was no liability framework for that kind of mission. It had never been accomplished before. People had flown to the International Space Station on the Soyuz, but it was like one seat was filled and then the other seat were filled with government astronauts. These was all civilian mission to the International Space Station. And I can tell you, a year and a half ago when we started talking about this, we were like, we have no idea how this is going to work. Are we going to have to indemnify everybody across the board, give them cross waivers, and require this kind of insurance, that kind of insurance? It was a heavy lift because there was no playbook. And it had to work for Axiom as well. It had to work for NASA. It had to work for the customers of that flight that Axiom procured. And it also had to work with the international partners, our international partners on the International Space Station. They had to agree to anybody coming up to the ISS and to the cross waivers and any kind of liability or insurance requirements that we were going to have. It was a very, very heavy lift. I'm not sure we got it right, but we enabled the mission, and now we can go forward, maybe tweak it. I'm sure Mary Lynn's got some ideas for me on how to tweak some of those provisions, but that was just a toe in the water compared to a 24/7, 365-day-a-year facility that is in low Earth orbit with people coming and going all the time and doing all kinds of interesting, amazing, and hopefully enjoyable things. So I guess I'm a little bit concerned based on that previous experience. We got there, right? So maybe that's a good thing, right? We can take that away. That'll be the glass half full, Brett. But it was also an unbelievable lift, and that's sort of the glass half empty. So I don't have any conclusions. That's where my headspace is right now.
Well, and I think to follow on from that, that's sort of a case-driven example, right? Where the case is in front of all of us. And so we have to sort of figure out a way to sort of be able to check enough boxes, to be able to get through it. And it's a first-time pass. And there'll be tweaks going forward. But with regard to the bigger picture issues having to do with insurance regimes and how that's going to be worked, we may very well be looking at a phased approach where, the government is going to maybe need to do some partial indemnification, or companies are going to have to go back to their investors and saying, we're going to have to pick up this much of a load to self-insure up to this point. There's been a lot of debate. There are even some sort of experimental approaches being taken on the government side, right? Where, to what extent do some of the traditional contractors, are they being expected to sort of insure up to a certain point, and then the government? So there's models that are kind of out there and people are exploring. I agree with Phil. I think it is a sticky wicket. And it's one that, we kind of have to work through over time, but I wouldn't be at all surprised to see some sort of a phasing, as opposed to just sort of like we wake up one day and this is going to be the framework by which we do this. That there may be sort of steps that we go through over time. But I also agree, we are going to have to come to solutions in time to be able to operate commercial modules on orbit and manage everything from personal liability down to structural issues and end to end. You're going to eventually have to, we pay for SpaceX to take our people, right? NASA doesn't pay for that. We pay for that. So how it is that you're going to manage, and Boeing, I hope, okay, I mean, eventually it's like, how do you manage that whole end-to-end package in terms of the insurance, and what does that framework look like? So yeah, a lot of questions to be answered there. And it may be that we do it in kind of chunks that we bite off.
So, at the Key program, we're very interested in leadership development. Any thoughts on what kind of leadership is necessary to drive, lead, and innovate in this area?
I think you need
big personalities out there, but
well, I think you need folks from all different walks of government and industry and finance and philosophy, if you will, and legal, right? It is it's not a fundamentally technological problem. It's a fundamentally there's a policy aspect, there's a technical aspect, there's a business aspect, and it's really the bringing of those things together that's going to move the whole ball forward.
Yeah, I would say something very similar to Brett, in that I think the strong leaders going forward are going to have a diversity of experiences. I think those of us in the federal government, it can be very easy just to stick with what you're doing. You're very comfortable with it. You know what it is. You know how to execute. You know you can be successful. And that's perfectly fine. But I think one of the reasons why I've been successful at NASA is because I had 20 years of experience in the private sector that I could bring to the government and sort of talk about these partnerships in a way that somebody who had spent their entire career at NASA would not necessarily be able to speak to. So as we are sort of breaking new ground, not just with NASA, but in a lot of these agencies now, I do think that the strongest leaders are going to have a diversity of experiences geographically, as well as within different kinds of business units or activities within your career. And so I would say seek out those kind of opportunities, particularly if you're in a sort of mid-career range. Now is the time to do that and, break out of your comfort zone. And you can then, you take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and you come up with another great idea that you wouldn't necessarily see if you had just been doing the same thing. I know it can be scary and it's very comfortable. We like to work in our comfort zones. But if you are really aspiring to being a leader going forward, I think that will be that will help you significantly, personally.
Thanks. I remember as the budget guy at NASA, I used to go around and talk to engineers and scientists, and I used to tell engineers that putting a credible, stable, operable budget together was a lot harder than rocket science. And because after all, rocket science is just based on the laws of physics, right? It's a technical problem. It's the behavior stuff around, working with all your stakeholders and every different, coalition and congressman and senator out there. That is the tough part, and just all those players coming together. So fascinating. Just a couple more little fun questions. Would you all step on one of those spaceships today and go into low Earth orbit?
Absolutely.
Yep, sure would.
Good. The ones, any particular models of spacecraft? The ones that have had the most use.
Anybody wants to send me, I'll go.
Awesome.
Well, and I think what's important about the response that we gave you so quickly, Andrew, is we are in the details of some of these companies, or some of these within these companies, understanding these systems. We understand the risks and the hazards, and how we have mitigated those hazards, and how we have structured the systems to be resilient and to be safe. And I think we were all like, yay, verily. And I think that we're not just saying that for salesmanship. Seeing the capability and the import by which we take these missions and these capabilities give us all confidence that we've done the right thing. Does it mean there's zero risk? No. But I think the paradigm, the capability, the people, the engineering knowledge base that we have accumulated in the United States over 50 years of human spaceflight has gotten to the point where you can feel confidence in these systems. I think it does take a certain personality maybe to do these kinds of things, but within that, I feel good about where the industry has, how far the industry has come on the safety and reliability of their vehicles.
Thank you. We should have had a poll for our listeners today to put on whether or not they would go
Yeah, I'd like to know.
Commercial
Brett
spacecraft.
he wants their email addresses too for the ones that say yes.
Yeah.
Did I mention I'm in sales?
Oh, you know, be that first user. You'll get a deal, right? Yeah, yeah. You know, the excitement that you all have, your immediate reaction there was telling, and I think you're all in this business for a reason. You know, the passion you bring to it, and I always will remember the moment where that first time where SpaceX launched and brought the reusable stage back down on top of the barge at sea. And I was in the office with Robert Lightfoot. He was acting administrator at that time at NASA. And we were just both like little kids watching that. It was like Buck Rogers coming back, you know, unbelievable that could actually happen. And and it was just literally jumping up and down in excitement.
I do have to point out that Blue Origin, we did it with New Shepard a month before they did. So just had to point that out. A little friendly competition.
Thank you. Does anybody have anything else to add or any other questions from our audience?
So I will add to that. What's interesting, what I find interesting is you might have gotten a similar result from a poll 15 years ago, but if you took that poll 15 years ago, even if you wanted to go, you could not buy a ticket because there was not a commercial capability to enable you to fly to space. And so we should all just step back for a second and say, that's pretty cool. We have created a capability in an industry that didn't exist before. And I think these statistics are correct. I didn't come up with these, but since the beginning of the space age, we've had about 500 people fly to space. 95% of them have been government employees. Over the next same time frame, that number is going to go up astronomically, no pun intended, and most likely the vast majority of them are going to be private citizens and not government astronauts. That is going to be a sea change. I really believe. And when people, I don't want to oversell the experience, but some people come back from space and they do say that it has changed them, changed their perspective. You see the planet from space, there's no borders. You see the thin blue line, which is the atmosphere, which is protecting us from radiation and other kinds of space hazards. And you get an appreciation for our home planet and a feeling of connectedness that you may never have gotten before and that you could only get from this experience. I think that kind of appreciation and feeling that kind of connectedness today with all the stuff that we have going on in the world can only be a good thing. And I'm really looking forward to that future and a lot more people being able to experience that.
So
Adam wants to know how soon he can apply to be a commercial space pilot. Anybody give him an estimation there?
Well, New Shepard, we don't have pilots. I was just going to say that next week on July 20th, which is the anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing, it's also the anniversary of our first human flight on New Shepard, where we sent 4 people into space and back. It's suborbital. We've had 5 flights in the last year, and the majority of those paid for it. You know, but we've flown people like William Shatner. We've flown people that were sponsored by scholarships, so that didn't pay for it themselves, but were given the opportunity to fly. And so the average person has an opportunity and increasingly has opportunities to fly and experience what Phil said. And every one of them that's come back has been deeply moved by the experience. I'm still waiting in line, but to watch them, have a different experience than a traditional government employee astronaut is really powerful.
And I will say, obviously we do have a pilot. Larry Connor actually for the AX-1 mission flew from Dayton, Ohio. Our folks do bring more money to the table. It's an orbital flight. It involves a long training stint, not as long as a full-fledged government astronaut, but months. And you really have to sort of set aside your life to decide that you want to go ahead and do this. But the folks that flew, of course, we had our commander was Mike Lopez Alegria, who was a former ISS commander and shuttle astronaut, former government astronaut. But our civilians that flew had the same response. It was here they had done all the training for it. Here they were prepared to go. But being up there, the experience was just, you can't know it until you fly it. And looking out the window, the same thing, what Phil's describing has been dubbed the overview effect. It was an intensely, deeply moving experience for all of them. And so I agree. I mean, the more people that are actually able to get up there and see the Earth as a whole, I think that is a good thing for all of humanity.
Agree. Wish I could do that. One other question here. What was your happiest moment related to your career, related to your commercial space, which all three of you work with?
Come on, nobody's all right. I'll go first. I was deferring to my. That's going to be an easy one. Well, it was the first time we flew a private cargo mission to the International Space Station. That was something that we've been working for 6 years. There was a lot of contentiousness and controversy, and when it was a several-day mission, so there was milestones every day, right? Every day, the launch had to go good. You had to deploy the solar arrays good. You had to berth to the International Space Station. Then you had to undock, and then you had to come down. The parachutes had to come down. You had to splash down. When that capsule was pulled out of the water and dropped onto that barge, I remember just this feeling of intense gratification and relief that even the crew mission that came afterwards didn't quite replicate. It was close when we first flew Bob and Doug. Those are the two astronauts that flew first on the SpaceX mission in 2020. That was also very gratifying. But I remember when that capsule dropped down on that barge, it was a very emotional experience for me.
I'll agree actually that the commercial crew program, the success of commercial crew is sort of the biggest moment in my commercial space career. I worked very hard to get it enacted through when I was the head of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation. It was part of the FY11 budget request and the NASA authorization bill of 2010. It enacted that paradigm shift that went from government owned and operated to a commercial framework. And before that, I had been at the White House under President Bush when Columbia went down, and what came out of that was the vision for space exploration, which sent us on the path towards the moon with international and commercial participation. So those two things, going back to the moon and the commercial crew program really are, to me, the nexus of what U.S. leadership in space is going to be in the next decades.
I'm really interested to hear Mary Lynn's answer. You've had so many different hats that you've worn over the years, Mary Lynn. You got to pick one. Andrew said you got to pick one. What's it going to be?
I know, it's really hard. I mean, I can remember talking to Mike Griffin at the time about the challenge that he had inside NASA trying to keep the funding fenced off for the commercial cargo program because of the challenges. People were trying to raid the money. And so it's really hard for me to pick one. I certainly was excited by all of these. I will say something that's probably going to come across a little bit sappy, and I don't mean it that way, but in terms of happiness and just huge relief in my recent experience, I would have to say it was when the X crew came down. And the reason for that is, like everyone here, I did live through Columbia in a very personal way because of associations with the crew. And so whenever there's a landing, I'm a happy critter. a safe landing when a crew comes back safely to Earth. I'm happy when they leave, but really happy when they come back safely. And so I'd say my recent experience, I mean, it was that one. It was when they were fished out and everybody was, sort of looking good. But I got to say that the COTS mission, the first COTS mission, and the commercial crew mission, because it was clearly opening the door. And you knew the door was being opened, and you also knew that you couldn't really see where it was going to go yet. And those possibilities that were sort of created there, at the edge of imagination, by having those missions happen, I think those were just sort of, I don't know if they were happy, but they were really profound.
Well said. Wonderful. I think that's a great place to end. We're at time. I just want to thank this panel. This has been a great conversation. It's wonderful to see you all. I'm glad I don't have my day-to-day job anymore. I'm retired from that, but but it's a great world that you guys are working in, and I appreciate all you're doing to go to infinity and beyond and keep moving. So thank you to all of you for participating today, and thank you to our audience and the great questions you posed. How long did it? One last question. How long did it take to get to the International Space Station? How long?
It generally takes about a day. It doesn't have to take a day. You can get there a lot quicker if you want. But generally, because of the phasing and because of the vehicles, it's about a day.
Okay.
It's about 2 to 3 days to get to the moon, and we estimate it's about 9 months to get to Mars. So gives you sort of an idea.
Okay. Well, listen, with that, we will finish. And Jennifer, I'm handing it back to you. Thank you all.